Buzz killers, it is me, the professor, and I am having a glorious morning. Do you want to know why I'm having a glorious morning? It's because on the line over the internets via Zoom is my favorite mythbuster, a myth smasher. You've heard her on the show before talking about the Titanic recently, and that is Kate Messner, who's here to talk about Christopher Columbus and the Taino people, her new book in the great History Smashers series. Kate, thanks so much for coming on the show. As I said on the previous show, you're so much better at this than I am.
I don't know about that. It's always such a joy to talk with you, though.
This is the latest book, and ever since our Titanic episode came out, buzzkillers out there have been telling me they're buying these books in droves, partly for their kids and even grandkids, but also for themselves because these are books made for middle school students, but they are also very readable and very engaging for adult readers. First of all, how are you able to do that? and second of all, what do you think it says about the fact that we don't need to treat middle schoolers as little unintelligent or less or soon to be intelligent but not there yet people. They're smart enough to grab and grasp complicated stuff.
Oh, for sure. And so are elementary school readers. It's interesting. This series is really aimed, this whole History Smasher series is aimed at smashing the myths that we're sometimes taught about history when we're very small, And just a little bit of background for those who perhaps didn't hear the other episode or aren't familiar with the series. We tackle topics that are often awash in myth. So the Pilgrims and the first Thanksgiving, the idea of the women's suffrage movement being all these women working together. Well, yes, but also it's really complicated. And what I have found, I visit hundreds and hundreds of schools and libraries and have met with thousands of kids in my school and library visits as a children's author. Kids are super savvy and they have so many great questions. They are curious, they are open-minded, and they're better at many adults at understanding that more than one thing can be true, right? We can have George Washington, the leader of the Continental Army, the first president of the new nation, who is also someone who enslaved hundreds of people, right? All of those things are true. And they can all be true at the same time. And this is something that just seems to, frankly, be too much for some adults in our country, especially right now when we're seeing so many book bannings and so many efforts to try and literally erase American history in particular. So this series is aimed at smashing the myths that we sometimes learn about history, telling the true stories as supported by historical documents, and telling the stories that haven't always been told in the dominant narrative. And so our first book in this series was about the Pilgrims. So it's called History Smashers, the Mayflower. It was all about the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag people who, of course, lived in that part of what is now Massachusetts for thousands of years before the Pilgrims arrived. And I had help with that book from Linda Coombs, who is a Wampanoag elder and scholar. And as soon as this series launched in the summer of 2020, families, educators, librarians were emailing saying, when are you going to do Columbus? My answer was, I would like very much to write that book, but I'm not going to write it by myself because that's kind of part of the problem, right? Is that we've had Western white people telling this story of colonization for hundreds and hundreds of years without the perspective of the Taino, who were the people who, like the Wampanoag in Massachusetts, who had lived in that part of the Caribbean that Columbus explored for thousands and thousands of years before he was even born. And so I would write back to those families, those teachers, those librarians and say, I'm really hoping we can do a Columbus book, but I'm going to wait until we can do it right. And so when it came time for History Smashers, Christopher Columbus and the Taino people, I emailed Dr. Jose Barrero, who is really America's foremost, probably Taino scholar and elder. He worked with the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian on their Taino exhibits. And I have to tell you, I was a little bit nervous, right? Because like, hi, My name's Kate. I'm really friendly. You don't know me, but would you like to write a book with me? But Dr. Burrow was absolutely amazing to work with. He understands the value in talking with young people about stories and about history, and said, "Yep, I would love to work with you." And so we worked on this book together. And so a lot of what I'm about to share with you today is actually Dr. Barrero's scholarship. And it was just invaluable to work with him on this book.
Well, it's wonderful that you were able to do that collaboration, and I think it shows in the book, right, the depth of the scholarship, but also, it's a book that has plenty of graphics, plenty of things that explain the history, a little bit more clearly and more frankly graphically than just pure text. So you haven't broken from the tradition of the History Smashers series. And I think that's really, really, really valuable. There are, frankly, graphic novel-esque cartoons in this book. And that really, I think, brings things home to everyone who reads it, no matter what their age is.
Yeah, we have found really with this whole series, and it's why they're so popular with young readers. Many, many kids love graphic novels. I grew up reading Archie and Veronica comic books. And sometimes I think as adults, we look at graphic novels and think, I know some adults say, "Are those really real books?" And I've even, in my teaching life, when I was a middle school educator, would run into parents who would say, "Oh, my kids are reading graphic novels and I don't know if that's okay." And I was like, "No, they're books, they're complex. They use amazing visual storytelling tools. There's a lot of critical thinking that goes into reading, thoughtful comics." So when we first conceived of this series, we wanted it to be very visual, right? We wanted it to have that casual, friendly storyteller's voice, as if you're talking with your favorite niece or nephew about history, saying, "Oh,
Mhm.
actually, here's how it was." And the other element that was really important to me is having a lot of visuals. So, photographs, lots of illustrations, and parts of the story are told in that graphic novel, that comic format. And we need to be a little bit careful with that, to be honest with you, with this history, because depending on what we're talking about, we can bring in a lot of humor. But depending on what we're talking about, we also don't want to be doing too much of a
Mm.
goofy mindset, right? The Taino people, we're talking about a genocide, we're talking about a tragedy. And so there's a really fine line to walk in telling that story with visuals in a way that's very respectful as well. And I have to give credit to our illustrators for this series. We have Dylan McConis, who does the cover art for the full series, and Fallon Cook, who does the interior art, the comics. And both of them are just amazing with research. And that's something I talk with kids about when I do school visits is you don't think about, you think about the author of a book having to do lots and lots of research. But the fact is, the illustrator has to do a lot of research too. And we went back and forth with, Random House's design team and Fallon and Dylan and Dr. Barrero, Jose, all talking about does this look right? Does this have the right look? And, at some point, Dr. Barrero would say, "You know what? Those Taino faces on page 61 don't look quite right yet. Here are some photos. Can we try again?" So there was a lot of back and forth, and I'm incredibly grateful to be working with illustrators who are also so committed to taking that feedback from experts and getting it right.
So then let's talk about the Taino people. They come to us in the book in chapter 4 with perhaps the greatest title I've ever seen for something like this, The People Who Discovered Columbus. So tell us about those people.
And thanks to Dr. Barrero for that title. I mean, we much is made of, in our preschool history lessons of, oh, Columbus discovered America. And of course, from your other discussions about Columbus, well, no, he actually never even was in what is now the United States. And of course, the Taino people and other native peoples were there before. But really, these people, it was a discovery. They were like, well, look, here are these men who have showed up. And so they were the people who knew all about the islands. They were the people
Mhm.
whose home it was and who lived there and who understood, everything about, those lands and the sea and how to use the resources sustainably. And so it's fascinating to me that for centuries, the perspective that we got was the European, the Spanish perspective on the Taino people. And it's very similar to what we see in other colonization and conquest cultures, right? Early on, the Spanish are described to the Taino in their letters back to Spain as, oh, these people are uncivilized. Well, they weren't. And the problem is Columbus shows up with his explorers. They don't understand the language. They don't
Mhm.
understand the culture. They think they're in Asia and are insisting that in spite of all the evidence to the contrary. They just didn't understand anything that they were seeing or hearing. So pretty much any time Taino culture or customs were different from the European experience, it got labeled as uncivilized or savage or primitive. And so many of those early descriptions, which thanks to the new Gutenberg printing press ended up all over, were just plain wrong. The Taino people were and are, because they still exist. And that's a huge myth that we're smashing in this book. This idea that the Taino people somehow vanished, somehow were gone after colonization. But they were at that time even healthy people numbering, over 1 million with sturdy houses, plenty to eat. They were organized. They welcomed strangers, which of course was part of the problem. Can I read to you just a few quotes from Columbus's journal? Because I think this really is fascinating how he spins what he is seeing. His first impression, he writes, at daybreak, great multitudes of men came to the shore, all young and of fine shapes, very handsome. Their eyes were large and very beautiful. They were straight limbed without exception, and not with prominent bellies, but handsomely shaped. They are free with all they possess. No one would believe it without having seen it. Of anything they have, if you ask them for it, they will never say no. Rather, they invite you to share everything they possess and show as much love as if their hearts went with it. So his first impression that he actually puts in his journal is, oh my gosh, these people are really attractive and they're so nice and they share. And very soon on the heels of that, he's writing to the Queen of Spain about the Spanish building a fort to protect themselves from these
Mm.
really nice people, which is a little strange, right? So he writes about this fort and says, I saw a piece of land, which is much like an island, though it is not one, on which there were 6 huts. It could be made into an island in 2 days, though I see no necessity to do so, since these people are very unskilled in arms, as your majesties will discover, from 7, whom I caused to be taken and brought aboard, so that they may learn our language in return. So that's some interesting word choice, right? 7
Mhm.
people who I caused to be taken and brought aboard sounds a lot like kidnapping, right? And that's exactly what Columbus started doing. He started taking the Taino people and writing back to the Spanish monarch saying, these people are so nice, they would make really good slaves. They're easy to
Mhm.
control. And so we went from, look at these nice, friendly people I met, to, boy, they sure would make good slaves in an instant. And it's just fascinating when you actually pull apart those letters and journals from Columbus. What was going on there? We don't know. We can't be inside his head. He insisted until his death that he had arrived in Asia, that he had accomplished his goal. There is a part of me as a historian and curious reader of these journals that cannot help but wonder if he actually knew somewhere along the way, and all of this other stuff, like, well, we have gold and we can set up forts, and look, they'd be good slaves, was all trying to like make it okay that he maybe hadn't found what he thought he found. We don't know what was in Columbus's head. We only know what he wrote, and we
Mhm.
know what he wrote. I always talk with kids about, when you read a historical document, think about the words in that primary source, but also think about the writer and the audience and what their goal was in writing to that audience. It was not in Columbus's best interest when he was writing to the Queen to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, because he was making mistakes, especially when it came to managing people once they had this colony established. It wasn't in his best interest at all to say, wow, I've really made a mess of this, right? Because he's depending on the king and queen for funding and for another voyage and for support and to send ships and people and supplies. It's interesting, as historians, we hold up primary sources as sort of the gold standard. It's like, well, was it a primary source? Well, yes, primary sources really need to be looked at with that critical eye, right? And when I talk to kids, I say, look, if you get in a fight with your brother and your mom shows up and says, whose fault was this? What happened? Are you going to tell her if you elbowed him first? Maybe not,
Mhm.
right? And so that's part of what we talk about when we talk about primary sources and critical thinking.
Well, but you're also showing a lot of primary sources and other source material that describe the culture of the Taino. I'm thinking particularly again in chapter 4, Buzzkillers who are following along, the excellent sort of series of panels that go from page 65 and onwards to talk about some of their belief systems, what they think about Columbus himself being there, and some of their views about their own world. And by world, I mean, in this case, the specific geographic setting where they are, not necessarily the world cosmologically. And I found that absolutely gripping because, again, as you say, we never hear this stuff.
Right. And it's interesting, the Taino have creation stories that are sacred. They did and still do have creation stories that are sacred. Just to share a little bit, these are really the foundations of their identity as indigenous people of the Caribbean. They honor ancient beings called semis and sing about them, and they believe these are their sacred ancestors who created the Caribbean. So there are stories. There's a story of a mother who died giving birth to quadruplet sons who are known as the Four Twins, which is a very big part of Taino belief, who went on to create that whole Taino world, how they obtained fire and how they took the sacred food, the cassava bread, which is this bread made from a root vegetable, cassava, that's actually healthier than flour. And so there's this whole story about how the twins, danced on the back of a sacred turtle and allowed this Taino world to be created, allowed for them to build their houses. And this is their story of how they understand their world and how they have come to make this a sustainable life in the Caribbean. They have plenty of food. They are trading with other islands, among the islands. They have an economy. It is very much the opposite of uncivilized, as Columbus had described them. But the Spanish are very specifically interested in colonization, but also in converting people to Catholicism. And so any creation story that is not their creation story is again looked at as, well, if it's Adam and Eve and the book of Genesis, that's religion and that's respected. But everybody else's creation stories are just uncivilized and strange. So
Mhm.
again, it's that perspective that we come into.
But I was also impressed about, you mentioned this trading with other islands. First of all, the distances they're able to cover without sail, by using paddle boats, some of which, as you point out in the book, carry up to 80 people plus cargo and other stuff. And this is obviously a group of people who are very much in control of their natural environment and are, if not in control of other groups on other islands, then definitely in sort of, if you will, diplomatic understanding of and economic trading with all the other people in the Caribbean, at least that can be reached with their boats.
Right. And it's interesting. We can file this in the big list of things that Columbus perhaps should have noticed, because there is a passage in his journal where he talks about seeing one of these big canoes. And it's not just the way we picture a canoe with a couple people, paddling. There is trade happening, that these people are traveling, that they have goods on that canoe, that they're going somewhere and engaging in trade. It's fascinating to me. The evidence was all there to show that these were people with a well-established community, with a well-established economy, a well-established civilization, except if you weren't willing to see it, you didn't see it.
Yeah, you don't suddenly develop the capacity to make 80-person log canoes out of tree trunks. This clearly takes generations and generations and generations of development and innovation. So these people have been civilized and cultured and sophisticated for a very, very long time.
For sure. So again, part of what we have is this idea of Columbus coming in and deciding that anything that doesn't match European beliefs, European customs, is uncivilized. But the other piece of that, I always talk with kids about this when I do school visits, is it really in Columbus's best interest to report back, oh, we got here and there's a civilization here. Like this is somebody else's home and they are running it just the way we are running things back in Spain. It's not, right? If your goal is conquest, then it's not in your best interest to acknowledge the civilization or the humanity of another group of people. And we see that in, not just in the Columbus story, but we see that in the way that the Pilgrims and Puritans wrote about the Wampanoag people and tribes of the Northeast as well.
Well, we don't want to give away too much of the book because, of course, we want Buzz Killers to get it. And like I said, I didn't even look at the price because very kindly your publisher sent me them. This is $8.99, and for history books, each of these history books, this is the best $8.99, $9 you're going to spend on a history book. Trust me, Buzz Killers, particularly the Titanic one and the one on women's suffrage. So in other words, we don't want to give away the whole book, but I'd like to talk about perhaps my favorite chapter, which is chapter 9, the Taino people today. And, we hear so much, depending on who you talk to, and almost all these people who we've gotten our information from are completely uninformed. But they say, oh, well, they're all those people were wiped out, right? There's still the myth of the vanishing Indian in the continental United States, and on and on and on. Well, clearly that's not the case, and I was absolutely fascinated by what you talk about in chapter 9.
That was a myth that I learned growing up. It's like, well, Columbus came and they had the wars, and then there were no more Taino people. And it's just patently false. Dr. Barrero's work, who's done just so much scholarship on this and has also written a wonderful a work of historical fiction for adults called Taino, has done so much research and spent so much time in Cuba in particular. It is true that there was a massive population decline after the Spanish showed up and engaged in this, period of conquest. And it is true that those European diseases to which the Taino people had no natural immunity, took a tremendous toll. The population plummeted, but the Taino people survived. Their way of life was changed, but the estimate from historians is that about 1 in 10 did survive. And there was a cacique, a Taino chief named Enriquillo, who resisted Spanish rule, took his people to the mountains, and they spent 14 years fighting the Spanish from the mountains until they eventually won a treaty and were guaranteed their own territory. In Cuba and Puerto Rico, and really throughout the Caribbean, many, many Taino people were enslaved by the Spanish, but they also rebelled. Some escaped. They formed communities, these sort of secret hidden communities, and they would use those as a base to raid Spanish farms and attack colonial troops. And eventually, when the Taino people, after 50 years or so, won their freedom from slavery, they stayed. Many of them stayed in towns. Some intermarried with the Spanish, but they continued to pass down that culture, the farming culture and the healing culture. And that culture is still very much alive on some Caribbean islands today. The surviving generation of Taino are often called Indios and have thrived. They've isolated themselves in many cases. They're, in the mountains in Cuba and elsewhere. But these are families that are still doing what they have always done. They are, farming and passing down generational knowledge and culture and language and tradition, and taking great pride in the fact that Taino people are still very much here.
Right. And from an American, that is Western hemispherical perspective, they are the people who discovered Christopher Columbus.
Absolutely.
Well, Buzzkillers, I praise these books to the sky. In fact, what's actually happened here at the Institute is we're starting to produce our own books, and Professor Nash, who you know very well, and I are writing the first one on Hitler and the Nazis. And we are using these books, many aspects of these books, the History Smashers series, as models of the best way to get across information to a broad range of readers. Again, I can't stress this enough. They are not, little kiddie books. They are, and I don't mean to say that insulting towards elementary school students, even though they're supposedly pitched at middle schoolers, everyone will enjoy them, will get a lot out of them, and will learn better history than they knew before.
I really appreciate you saying that. It's so much fun for me. This is a series aimed at fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth graders. And it's fascinating. When I go into schools, kids will come running up to me and say, I taught my mom this, and my dad don't know this. And we were talking about this at the Thanksgiving dinner table. And they love teaching their grown-ups about history.
Well, and that's one of the reasons why I'm so happy that so many of my listeners are buying these for their kids and for their grandkids. And then those kids and grandkids will turn around and teach them. So really, it just remains for me to say thank you so much, Kate, again, for not only coming on the show, but writing another great book. Buzzkillers, the book is on the Buzzkill bookshelf. We put as many links to some of the things we've talked about today on the blog post without trying to give away too much because it's all there in the book. And we will talk to all of you next week.